So, experimental research and field experiment. Every research need identification of a problem. So, it is true that in experimental research and field experiment research, or whether the experiment you are carrying in field or in laboratory, you need identification of the problem. How to identify a research problem? There are two things which must be taken care of. One is select a narrow research area, means go into deep and deep. In other words, in our example, we were trying to study addiction. So from internet addiction to we came to a internet addiction, and from internet addiction we narrow down to Facebook and Instagram addiction, and later on it can be further studied, Instagram addiction separately and Facebook addiction separately. In Instagram and Facebook, porn addiction and nudity addiction, that can be a really area of research. So that way research area is narrowed down. Then investigator must formulate the hypothesis. This is the second condition of identification of a research problem. Means unless and until you have certain assumptions that what can be probable finding or what can be the probable aspect which you have to put as a hypothesis which needs to be tested. For testing you should have some concrete statement, and that statement is hypothesis. So have a hypothesis, then only your research problem will be identified appropriately. Your research will have a value. Now, experimental research. Again, experimental research, one is in the field and second is in the laboratory. Here field experiment is given more thrust. Now, experimental requires two variables. Experiment required two variables. One is independent variable and second is dependent variable. So, in an experiment, what is important? That experimenter required two variables. The independent variable should be manipulatable. It can be manipulated, and independent variable must be associated with dependent variable. Association is important. So when there is association and when manipulation of independent variable is possible, you can do the experiment. Third condition, all other extraneous factors are completely controlled. The control can be in laboratory, the control can be obtained in field. Like I told you, selecting a sample of intelligence 100 means we are keeping intelligence constant, and that is possible. 100 is the intelligence of many people, but if you keep a intelligence range from 90 to 110, now here you are studying the population of your interest, but the intelligence is not constant. You are studying the population of average intelligent people. You have taken a sample of average intelligence people. But because it is from 90 to 110, your intelligence is not constant. Generally, we can manipulate one or more variable to determine their effect on dependent variable. So, independent variable can be more than one. Like, we can take one example: impact of hyperactivity, inattentiveness, and impulsiveness on behavior with parent. Impact of inattentiveness, impulsiveness, and hyperactivity means aggression on behavior with parent. So behavior with parent is a dependent variable, and I have selected 3 independent variables. Now this will be a field experiment. This will be a ex post facto experiment, not this will be a ex post facto experiment, because here you cannot manipulate hyperactivity, inattentiveness, and impulsiveness of a boy. So actually the study is about the ADHD type child, because all these 3 symptoms are observed in ADHD child. So that way independent variable can be more than one. Similarly, independent variable has to vary at 2 levels. Like impact of study, impact of time given to study on percentage scored by the SSC student. So you will select a student who have studied for 2 hours, 3 hours and 4 hours. So this is called as levels. Independent variable, same variable can be manipulated at 3 different levels. So that is the way experimental research is carried, and independent and dependent variable is handled. Now field experiment. So I said there are 2 types of experiment. One is laboratory experiment and second is field experiment. In psychology, field experiment are more popular. So field experiment, we take 2 groups matched for number of factors such as age, sex, education and socio-economic status. In other words, when 2 groups are selected, we try to select a 2 groups which are having same intelligence level, personality factors and their demographics also. But maintaining such tight control many times is not possible in actual experiment. So normally demographic factors are well controlled. And which are the demographic factors? Age, sex, education level, socio-economic status, like they are belonging to upper class or middle class or lower class. In India, there is one more factor which has the highest impact, that is religion. The religion must also be controlled. By default, we get maximum people from one religion, that is true. But people from other religion, if entering into your sample, that is going to hamper your result. That is possible. So, keeping many factors constant is a need of a field experiment. Now further, in addition to demographic factor, you can keep intelligence constant. You can, if required, keep personality factors constant. Again, maintaining that constancy is not easy. It requires lot of cost. And when you do that, then the experiment inclines towards laboratory experiment. Now here one example is given. This example is very preliminary to understand. So I will not take this example. That will increase the confusion. So I will straightway shift to differences between experimental research and field research. Here experimental research is considered as laboratory experiment. This you have to keep in mind. I was telling you experiment can be done in laboratory as well as in we can call it as experimental research. But here in book, terminology wise, experimental research is considered as laboratory experiment, and field experiment which is done in the field, that you have to keep in mind. Now experimental research, all participants, they are called as subjects, all participants must be homogeneous, whereas in field they can vary in number of characteristics. In experiment, tight control, whereas in field setting is natural. In experiment, manipulation of independent variable is effectively possible. Here, one is subjected to intervention while the other is not. You cannot tightly manipulate independent variable. Particularly, independent variable is manipulated, dependent variable is not manipulated. In experiment, in laboratory experiment, you can manipulate both the variable. All extraneous factors are controlled and the pure effect of intervention can be studied. More accurate result will be produced by experimental or so-called laboratory experiment. Whereas the accuracy of field experiment will not be as good as of laboratory experiment. Then prediction is accurate in field or laboratory experiment. Here the prediction can change from situation to situation. In laboratory experiments, results are predicted in quantitative terms, in percentage, percentage terms, also with scientific terminology of quantification. Whereas in field, normally it is referred as percentile terms, standard deviation terms, terminology little change. In other words, qualitative and quantitative terms. Like qualitative terms means severe anxiety, that is qualitative terms. But quantitative term, percentile 80, percentile 90, that is quantitative term. So in laboratory field experiment, more quantitative term will be used, whereas in field experiment, qualitative and quantitative term both can be used. Here the experiment is replicable, means it can be produced as it is in the another city where when same field experiment is done in other place, little change is required. Change can be required in many areas, but change is required. So that is the difference. When you will actually do the experiment, you have to then you will understand it. Then strength and weaknesses of the field experiment, advantage or strength of the field experiment. That is self-explanatory, so I will not go here. It is useful in behavioral and social scientists. Field experiment is useful to behavioral and social scientists, whereas laboratory experiment is useful to material scientists in physics and chemistry. Many complex phenomena are studied with the help of field experiment, which cannot be brought into laboratory setting. Complex phenomena cannot be studied in laboratory setting. Theory and solution to many problems are obtained through field experiment. Flexibility and applicability to wide variety of problems, particularly in social science, field experiment are useful. That is the one statement you can remember. There are weaknesses, that is controlling extraneous variable, controlling intervening variable is not possible. Researcher's attitude, if it is negative, then again it is very difficult that you are going to observe when you will submit your project. Consent and cooperation of concerned subject means the participant, the respondent, their consent, their cooperation sometimes vary. It can change. For one day they may be cooperative, second day they may not be cooperative. While taking the pre-test data, they may be highly cooperative. While taking the post-test data, they may not be so cooperative. That affects the result. That is the disadvantage of field experiment. Then here, construct the field experiment. Now this is a detailed process. I will try to construct one field experiment for you. But what has to be done? It is simply I am going to explain. You have to plan, you have to collect the appropriate sample, then you have to have a good research design, then you have to select the standardized tool for data selection. Here in experimental research or in field experiment, it is better to have a standardized tool. Then sampling procedure for experiment, that you have to finalize, and finally what statistical technique will be used and how statistical analysis will be done. Here the research design is explained well. Research is a scientific methodology in controlling setting. Research is a scientific methodology in a controlled setting, and that is why appropriate research design is required. The controlled observation means that we have to see the impact of independent variable on dependent variable under specific control condition, and we have to manipulate independent variable to the extent of change occurring into a dependent variable. It has to be manipulated systematically, and the records of relative changes must be maintained. What kind of changes is taking place on dependent variable? Sometimes these kind of changes are precisely observed with certain statistical technique like t-test and ANOVA. Now Kerlinger He said there are three things important in research design, that is plan, structure and strategy of investigation. I am from long time trying to write plan, structure and strategy of investigation, but many times I feel writing it correctly is very difficult. But plan is, you can simply say that, the precise way of implementation. The structure is diagrammatically representation of what you are going to do and what is going to happen. And strategy is key factors which you are using in your planning itself. Key elements, that is a strategy. Then objective of research design, to provide answer to a research question, that we know. To control variance under study, yes, that is true. Criteria of good research, there are 6 criteria given for a good research. Does the design give a specific answer to a research question? All are the questions. Does the design adequately test the hypothesis? Does the design present the appropriate question or problem? Does the design adequately control the extraneous independent variable? Can we generalize the result of the study to the other subject? Does the design give the internal and external validity? All these answers will obtain only when you will do the work. Hypothetically or for study purpose, these are the questions and there is no single answer to these questions. So that is why it is given in the question from criteria of good research design. There is no appropriate answer. Answer will be obtained when you will actually use the result design and when you will obtain the result. So on the basis of an obtained result, you can say whether these questions were answered appropriately or not. Whatever a good design you make, mistakes are likely to happen. And it is not by fresher, it is by the expert also. I have seen that Nagpur University sometimes rejected many synopses submitted by expert like Dr. Helode, Dr. C.G. Pandey, Dr. A.V. Kulkarni, Dr. Yavlikar and so many such other experts. So Nagpur University panel have rejected their synopsis. They have been called to resubmit it. I am also suffered from similar rejection. So you cannot answer all these questions before completion of your research. So these questions remains questions and you will get the answer when your research will finish, and it is not necessary that all questions are answered appropriately or correctly. You cannot guarantee it. Type of experimental research. There are various types given. Single case experimental design. In the beginning I said you select hardly 5 to 10 people to study the schizophrenia. So that is such design is in which the number of respondents are very few and you are studying a very specific area. In a single case experiment you can use single person also, but then that will be a descriptive study, that will not be an experimental study. Then quasi experimental design. All experimental situation in which the researcher does not have full control over the assignment of experimental unit randomly to the treatment condition, or the treatment cannot be manipulated, are collectively called as quasi-experimental design. Again, this definition has to be understood precisely from other group, but I will just explain you that when complete control is not possible, which we expect in experimental design, then such experiments can be called as quasi-experimental, or design is called as quasi-experimental design. Experimental design, this type of design is generally conducted in laboratory with complete control over all variables and all subjects. Complete control, only it can be obtained in laboratory. Very difficult, it is practically impossible to obtain the entire control in field. Now, experimental designs have few names: between subject design, within subject design, mixed design, classical pre-test, post-test, solo 4-group design, and factorial design. 6 are given here. Now, between subject design means there are 2 independent groups. That is between subject, 2 independent groups. Whereas within subject design, or it is also called as repeated measure, means group is same. It can be a group of SSC student and we do experiment twice. We obtained data twice on the same group. So that is called as within subject. Mixed design, we use both between subject and within subject. Classical pre-test, post-test, when interventional studies are done, before intervention observations are collected or data is collected, and if after introduction of intervention data is collected again with the same measurement or with the parallel form measurement. Then 4-group design, you take one sample and you divide into 4 groups. Actually, this is normally done in agriculture. They take 1 acre of plot and they make up 4 parts of that plot where the soil difference is there, and they will use only one type of beach, and they will see the result, the kind of crop obtained in a 4 plot, because in all 4 plots the soil is different, the color of the soil is different. So they find out how much crop is received in a 4 different type of soil. So 1 acre can be divided into 4 parts. That way, one group can be selected and they can also be divided into 4 in social science also. And factorial design, it is typically called as 2 by 2 design. I will explain this design in detail later on. So here I am ending. I am 4 minutes late, but now we can stop here. Thank you very much. Sir has to go.